Are you new to real-time strategy, or returning after a hiatus of some sort? Well, if that's the case, then this is the video for you. Today we're going to go through a bunch of categories to find the best game for you, and also go over some of the reasons you might want to play RTS in 2023. Links to every game we talk about will be in the description. You might be looking for the games with the best competitive multiplayer, the biggest community, the best campaigns, whatever it may be. This video was made in collaboration with the folks in my Discord, all of whom have their own experiences with RTS. You can join the Discord yourself by becoming a supporter either on Patreon or here on YouTube memberships. Thanks very much for your support. Before we list some games, I want to talk about the reasons you might want to play RTS to begin with, especially in 2023. I think there's three main ones. The first is the variety. There are just so many RTS games. There's been a 30-year history, or thereabouts, of real-time strategy games, and there's just so many settings, there's so many visual styles, the gameplay can range from simple to complex, you've got full series that have come out over decades, there's one-off releases, and then there's the gameplay options, and again, there's so many. There's solo, there's PvP, co-op, there's just, I don't want to say infinite options on how to play, but basically whatever you're looking for, you can find. And lastly, we have all the communities that are involved in RTS. There are just a ton around to get invested in if you're looking to find a new group of like-minded friends to play with all over the world. I always find that people in RTS are always keen to share, their favorite game with new members. So while it does seem intimidating for some, I actually think it's one of the nicest communities out there. Okay, but you also might have heard some things about RTS. Are the things that people say about it true? One big one is that people think it's too complicated. And, I guess it can be, but it really does depend on the game, even the series for that matter. There is the incredibly simple kind of RTS adjacent games that you can start with, like Command & Conquer Rivals on mobile, for example, which I will defend to my dying day that is actually a good game. Or you could look at something on PC that is still a bit more complicated, but honestly it is fairly simple, something like an Empire at War or Company of Heroes. And yeah, of course, I'll admit it absolutely can get complex with some games, but it doesn't have to be. If you've played any game before, you'll be fine. If we could figure it out when we were like 5 or 10, you can definitely do so today. Another thing I hear is that people think it's impossible to get into if you've got no experience. And I really don't think that's true at all. I hear people say that the walls are too high to get into RTS. I think it's just stigmatized like that because either the high-end PvP looks like insane to comprehend and really difficult, which it is, and personally I'm not a fan of it at all, and also because of a lot of the complex mechanics and gameplay strategies in RTS games that are there, but you don't really need to interact with them to have fun. I think people don't really see the best parts of RTS, like, the really good single-player campaigns, or late-night co-op games against the AI. It's those things that I think make the genre unique, and something that really anyone can get into and enjoy. Lastly, the most common thing I hear, that the RTS genre is dead. And yeah, look, I'll be the first to admit it's not the kind of big, massive player that it used to be. Trends develop and the masses will move on to whatever's hot. But RTS is still here, and honestly it's probably in the best place it's been in for a really long time. There are a ton of indies and AA studios releasing new titles, both big and small. And like I said, there's a 30-year history to go back on here, and people still play some of those old games to this day. And like I said, the communities, there's tons of them, some of them are really big, some of them are really small, and honestly, they're some of the nicest people you'll ever interact with online. Time for the games. Alright, so these ones are for newcomers, so that's for anyone out there who has literally never played an RTS before or has very, very minimal experience. The games in this section need to be a few different things. 1, they need to be easy to pick up and play. 2, they need a semi-decent community surrounding them. And 3, they need to be not too niche in terms of playability and room to grow. There should be an obvious next step after playing said game. So these are your best options. And we'll start with one you could probably guess, Age of Empires 2 Definitive Edition, but really you can play any version of Age of Empires 2. I'd recommend the Definitive Edition though, for ease of use and the most content. The thing with Age of Empires 2 is that it's a familiar setting. It's been around for 25 years. Everyone's heard of it, even if they're not a fan of RTS. Like, you've probably played it yourself, or you know someone who's played it. It's just incredibly ubiquitous. And the great thing about it is that there's a lot of room to grow, and it's easy to learn, to get the fundamentals. You can kind of get your head around it in terms of just understanding what it is. You've got a town, you've got to get food and get resources. There's no complex thought required to imagine what you need to do. You build villages or soldiers, and you fight, and you get resources. It really is that simple. And it includes tons of options for gameplay, and a lot of room to grow no matter what kind of gameplay you do. So obviously you could do ranked ladder. I wouldn't recommend you start there, but you could if you wanted. And there's tons of AI options to either play solo or co-op, and you can start really easy and get really difficult. And lastly, the campaigns and tutorials in particular are really good in Age of Empires 2. They're very effective, and there's just a lot of them. So you can start with the really simple William Wallace tutorial campaign, and then go through all the other campaigns that have been released over the past 2.5 decades. And there's of course co-op campaigns, which I particularly like here. They're just really fun and a good way to kick back and learn the ropes. Just tons of really good options with Age of Empires 2. Next, we'll go to Company of Heroes. Probably the first one, but you could make an argument for 2 or 3. I just think the first one is easiest. The thing with Company of Heroes is that it doesn't feel like a normal RTS game. I have a friend from high school who hates RTS. He plays some games, mostly shooters. He doesn't like RTS at all. He just hates the micromanaging of it. But we got him to play Company of Heroes, and he doesn't mind it. Still not his favourite game, but he actually enjoyed it because it feels like more of an action game and less of a strategy game. Like AoE 2, it's easy to understand with the real-life comparisons. Another good thing about it is that there's a lot of spectacle in Company of Heroes. Even if you're bad at the game, it's fun to watch. You've got huge explosions, you've got tanks firing. It's quite a visceral game, and it always feels like you're making an impact, even if you're kind of losing the game. So we found this especially with our friend who was playing it. We were playing co-op, so we were able to carry him, but he could have fun just by kind of building troops and a couple of tanks and making him feel like he was making an impact. Even if he really wasn't doing anything at all. Gameplay wise, it's quite easy to learn, but it's hard to master. If you want to get really good at it, you can, and there's a lot of room to grow there. Options wise, I think co-op is the best one for Company of Heroes, but there are also a ton of campaigns, and that's across Company of Heroes 1 or 2 or 3 even. So if you want to play by yourself, then there are lots of good options to do that too. For the third one here, I'm going to go to Dawn of War, mostly for its single player. The campaigns are great, and no matter what game in the series you play, I think the campaigns are all pretty good. Dawn of War 1 is your more traditional RTS, Dawn of War 2 is arguably simpler, more like Company of Heroes with kind of squad gameplay and not a lot of base building, so that could be a good way to get in. And then Dawn of War 3 is a bit of a mix. I think both Dawn of War 1 and 2 are the best to pick up and play in their own right. They're different, but on their own, I think you can get into them fairly easily. And it also offers a pretty cool setting. You might be into Warhammer or just want kind of a more fantastical sci-fi setting, as opposed to the historical ones from Age of Empires and Company of Heroes, so this is a really good choice for that. Alright, co-op multiplayer. My personal favourite section. So these can either be for comp stomping, so versus AI with friends, or co-op campaigns. Games here obviously need to excel at co-op play. They need to be great to play with friends. And personally, I think this is the best part of RTS. A good co-op RTS can provide a wealth of great experiences. And here you'll find a mix of games that provide different experiences on their own, but ultimately are just a blast to play with friends against the AI. And like the last section, we're going to start again with Age of Empires 2. The good thing with this, for co-op in particular, is that it's a low buy-in. It's pretty cheap to buy Age of Empires 2 on Steam sales, and there's a good chance that you and some friends probably own it already. You might own the HD edition instead of the definitive edition, but it doesn't really matter. You can play the HD edition just fine. If you have friends on Xbox or PC and own Game Pass, it's on there. So what I'm trying to say is that it's going to be either really cheap to get into it, or you probably own it already. The co-op campaigns in AoE 2 are really great, and they're just fun to play with friends. They're a really good way to learn the game without having any kind of external pressures. And like I said in the first section, everyone knows about Age of Empires 2. It's universally loved. Like, I reckon you could convince pretty much anyone to play a game of AoE 2 with you. It's really hard to not enjoy something in Age of Empires 2. Okay, moving on, Company of Heroes again, but specifically Company of Heroes 2. Mainly because it's a really mature game and there was a lot of content that was made for it, so lots of options, and it's cheap, you can pick it up on sales for not a lot at all, and there are really cheap ways to get into it with the standalone expansions. The comp stomping in Company of Heroes 2 is really awesome. The games can be really short if you want to do like a quick fire, get into it kind of match, or they could be longer if you want to do massive maps with lots of players and lots of capture points. It's just a ton of fun to play with mates against the AI. There's lots of great moments of, friends helping friends that kind of come out of a Company of Heroes game. Just lots of great moments that you can go to your friend and go, hey, nice job. Lastly here, I'm going to go with Supreme Commander 2. This is a bit of an odd choice, and some of you won't like it if you're a Supreme Commander fanatic, but it's a really easy entry point to more complex RTS games. It's larger scale than most of the other games we've talked about, so it kind of offers something a bit different there. The campaign is also not bad if you're a newcomer, but the co-op with friends really does stand out to me. You could jump into Supreme Commander 1 directly if you want to, it's up to you, it's a lot more complex and a lot harder to learn initially. I'll put that in an extras category here, so Supreme Commander 1 and the Loud mod. I've made a point to not include mods in this list because I want you to be able to get in and play without difficulty, but the Loud mod's pretty easy to download and install and it's worth it. The mechanics in Supreme Commander 1 are really deep and it is quite hard to learn, but it's really rewarding, so if you have a little experience in RTS, this might be a really good option. It can be really strategic and it actually can be pretty cozy too if it's not a really stressful game. Also, one more option here, I'll give the shout out to Bar or Beyond All Reason. It's similar to Supreme Commander, but it's free, so the buy-in is really easy. There's a couple of good co-op options, though they are very hard, but otherwise you can co-op against the AI as well. The mechanics, like Supreme Commander, are pretty deep and it's quite hard to learn, but it's probably not quite as complex as Supreme Commander. And the games are quicker, so you don't have to be as invested as Subcom. There's a few good mechanics included in the game as well that allow your teammates to carry you, so if you're not as good, your teammates can kind of bring you along for the ride and you can learn as you go. So it's a good option. Alright, so on to my least favourite category, and that's PvP multiplayer, mostly competitive ranked play. This section is a tough one, because there are a lot of smaller RTS communities out there that will have pretty good PvP environments, but the player base is quite small, and I'm targeting this to be more of a ranked experience where you can play against a wealth of different people of different skill levels. So naturally, these games need to have large communities that support a wide range of players, and for that, there's only a couple of options. And well, this is a familiar sight, it's Age of Empires 2, particularly the Definitive Edition. This one is obvious because it's the biggest RTS community with the biggest player base, it just makes sense. It's the easy choice because it just has the most variety. It has the most players by far, there's a ton of guides online and ways to learn, and there's a great community around that learning and also in competing. There's a really high skill ceiling for AoE 2, obviously the game's been around for 25 years so there is a lot of very good players, but there's also a lot of new players, obviously thanks to the re-releases and the fact that the game is available on Xbox and PC with crossplay. Because of all that, investing your time is worthwhile and it's really rewarding to climb the ladder, and you're able to because there's a good range of players without everyone being centered right at the top who have played it for 20 years. The other game I'll say here is Age of Empires 4 actually, basically because it's probably the next biggest in terms of player base. It's also fairly new and it's well supported by Microsoft, which is great. AoE 4 is a bit different to AoE 2, and it's newer, so there's likely not as many like super grandmaster level players, so there's probably a better split between the new and experienced players, and it's also now released on Xbox, which should bring in a new group of players to play with on the ladder. I'll say here before we move on to the next section, basically any big RTS could fill a role in this category because the most important thing with a PvP game is that the player base is large. So keep your eye out on any kind of big new RTSs that come out. Something like Homeworld 3 next year could be a really good option. Alright, next up is single player, so the best single player campaign or skirmish games. Games in this category, like I said, can be here for different reasons. They can have excellent campaigns, or just be really fun to play on their own in skirmish or other game modes. I think this would be the most contentious category because you really could include any good RTS campaign in this list from the past 30 years. But remember, I'm aiming this generally at newcomers or people coming back to RTS, so the games on here need to be Both really great, but also really easy to access, download, and play. But please do leave your suggestions down below. I'd love to see what you think. First up is Dawn of War 1 and 2. These games have both been around for a while and they both have their own expansions, so there's a ton of campaigns to play and there's variety between them. Particularly with Dawn of War 1, with it offering different types of campaigns across its expansions. And the skirmish is really fun in Dawn of War 1 as well, not so much in Dawn of War 2. The other good thing is that you can play all of these in order for a consistent and coherent story, but you don't have to. You could jump into Dawn of War 2 without knowledge of Dawn of War 1 and be fine. Next we'll go to Star Wars Empire at War, in particular the Galactic Conquest mode. It's easy to understand, but it's even easier to sink hours into it, mainly because of some really great gameplay that's still unique among other RTS games. And if you don't want to do a full Galactic Conquest, then Skirmish is also really great. The games are pretty quick, they're easy to understand, and they're just a lot of fun. There's also a ton of mods to play, and like I said, I didn't want to really talk about mods, but if you do want to get into, installing some mods and trying something new, Empire at War has a ton of really great options, and they're super easy to install through Steam, so highly recommended. It'd be hard to not talk about Command & Conquer here, so let's do that. There are a ton of great campaigns across the whole series, and Skirmish is pretty good too. This is one of the grandfathers of real-time strategy. There are 2 entire sagas that you can play through in the Tiberium and Red Alert games, and you can do start to finish with coherent stories, mostly, and all of them are really well designed. It's quite fun to see how RTS has evolved over 2 decades, so that's a pretty unique experience here. You could start with Command & Conquer 1, which was the 90s, and end with, Kane's Wrath, or Red Alert 3, which is the late 2000s. Skirmish in all the games is great, but it's particularly good in Command & Conquer 3 and Red Alert 3. I think Command & Conquer 3 is probably the best skirmish in the series. Tiberian Sun is also a pretty good follow-up. But if you're looking for some really good campaigns across a whole swath of releases, then Command & Conquer is probably your best bet. Lastly, Age of Mythology. And I will say Age of Empires 2 again here, but I don't want to mention it again, so let's put it to the side. The campaign in both the base game and the expansion is pretty decent, they're quite well presented, and quite unique with its setting. Skirmish is also really fun, thanks to that kind of Age of Empires style gameplay, and like that game, it's pretty easy to grasp the basic concepts. I will do one extra game here. It is quite a complicated one, but I think it's worth it, and that is Total War Warhammer 3, but it really could be any Total War game since, Empire. The reason I'm putting it in here is just because it is really an endless single-player environment. It's similar to Galactic Conquest from Empire at War as a grand strategy and RTS mix, but to a much bigger and more complex scale. Once you figure out the ropes, you can easily sink hundreds or thousands of hours into one or multiple of these games. There's tons of historical settings, like in Shogun 2, or Napoleon, Rome. Basically any since Empire are probably going to be fine to play, and there's been a lot of different releases through there. They don't really feel dated at all, especially if you're new to the series, so I'd highly recommend just choosing your favourite setting and getting in there. And I can't stress enough that if you click with this kind of game, you can just sink so many hours. You'll just lose countless nights of sleep. It is so much fun. It's a great mix of hybrid gameplay that, while a lot of other games kind of do mimic that style, there's just nothing like Total War, man, I swear. To do well in it, you either need to spend quite a bit of time figuring out how the game plays. The tutorials are not bad, but it would really help if you had some upfront knowledge of RTS, and yeah, a bit of 4X knowledge would also help. It's not absolutely a requirement, you can learn on the job, but it'll be a lot. But if you do that and you like the kind of gameplay it provides, you honestly could have potentially thousands of hours of fun with Total War. I hope this video has helped you decide on what RTS game you should play or come back to in 2023. If you disagree with the games that I've listed, then I really would like to hear what you think, so please leave them down below. And thank you so much for watching, and big thanks to my patrons and YouTube members who support me in the channel. So that's Dakayo, Wintendo, Bad Ghosts, Sean, Grey Spirit 4, Peter, Tim, George, Nedders, John Kaiser, King Thickums, Pavel, Bram, Christian, Dan 4, Bishop's Arch, and Orion, who's new at the Cavalier tier, thank you very much. And my paladins, Johnny, Marika, Age of Cause, Joe, Tank, and Empyrean. What food in New Zealand do you recommend to a tourist? Well, there's a couple of really good pie shops in the South Island, one in a town called Renwick, the Renwick Bakery, and one in a town called Fairlie. But if you're not around those two, then any fish and chips on the beach will do just fine. What's the earliest game you've played that you can recall for PC and console each? PC, it's probably Microsoft Flight Simulator 95. We had all of those and I did enjoy them quite a bit. And console, I believe it was Crash Bandicoot 1 for the PlayStation 1. What is your favourite playstyle when it comes to an RTS race or faction? Like swarming, or turtling, aggressive, etc. I'm a turtler, personally. I like to kind of go slow, bit upper base, and then win with overwhelming force. But I can't really do that in PvP, and so that's why I don't really like PvP. Do you prefer games with one resource, 2, or 3, or 4, or more? Personally, I don't really have a preference, more on how it's implemented, but if I had to choose, I guess 4 with Age of Empires is probably my favourite. If a developer was making an RTS game based off an existing game's universe or lore, what universe would you want them to use and why? It's a bit of a cop-out, but I would really like to see just another good Star Wars RTS again. I think there's a lot of room for a good game in there. Just an Empire at War sequel. Yeah, just space and land. Give me both. What's your real-time job and how did you get into drinking? Crossed out, I mean doing videos. Well, if you compare the first sections I filmed in like a real-life setting compared to the ones I do now, you might be able to guess I'm a videographer. And I started doing videography seriously about 4 years ago. Have you played any RTS that has a resource mechanic where you convert one resource to another, like desynced? Nothing that really pops to mind. I haven't really played many production style games in the past, so getting that kind of efficiency curve was pretty unique and desynced, and it was a lot of fun. Why do you think RTS games aren't as popular now as they were in the early 2000s? I think it's a mix of things. I think the general kind of gaming masses have always just been kind of transient and they just move on from thing to thing, and RTS was the thing for quite a while, and then it became not the thing, and other things popped up with like mobile gaming and more kind of fast-paced games. So I think it's that, but then also the things that come with that, like publishers don't want to fund as many games because it's not as popular, and then less people play them, and it goes on and on. So I think it's a mix of those things, but I think RTS is in a pretty good place right now, and it's probably in the best place it's ever been in the last 10 or maybe not 20 years, but probably in the last 10 years. Have you found any new RTS that's in space, 2D, and starts with the word age? There is one that comes to mind. What do you think about Unity? How will the game industry change? Max 3 words. Unreal going big. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you all next time.